Hello everyone. I'm back, but in a much less strenuous capacity. All I have to do is to try to maintain order, which ought to be relatively straightforward. As a visitor, I feel a little bit ridiculous in introducing Ruth Gavison to this group because she's so well known to all of you. As you know, she is a professor at Hebrew University with broad areas of expertise, including ethnic conflict, protection of minorities, human rights, political theory, judiciary law, religion and politics. She and I had some of the same teachers at Oxford, and so it's a pleasure for me to actually finally meet her and to listen to her discussion. She's going to talk about some recent work she's done on an important commission here in Jerusalem. And I've invited her to speak for as long as she'd like. We have at least 90 minutes, and so I think we'll ask her to sort of talk for 30 to 45 minutes, whatever she'd like, and then we'll open the floor to questions. I'll keep a queue, and we'll simply ask that people keep their questions and comments brief so that we can accommodate as many people as possible. Ruth, let me turn the floor to you.
Very much. Without further ado, let's start. It's a complicated mission that I have to perform today, and I will make a historical backward and forward movement and try to show the complexity of my mission, the one that I have just concluded, and the subject that I'm trying to raise here. Let me start from the end. You have two texts in front of you, and one of them is a bill that was proposed in 2011, but really is a bill that was re-proposed in 2013 and has contributed some, I don't think a lot, but some, to the crisis in the coalition that resulted in calling the elections that we just had. Because the coalition, even before getting to the Knesset itself, the coalition had a debate about this proposed legislation whose purpose was to anchor as a basic law, which is in Israel a part of the constitution, to anchor in a basic law the identity or the character or the vision of Israel as the nation state of Jews. I presented the first one, the 2011 one, because I wanted you to see that this is not an extremist proposal. You can see the first page are the MPs that signed this bill, and this is about a third of the Knesset. Now, the MP who proposed this bill was a member of the Kadima party, the largest party in the then Knesset, not the last one, but the one before that. And Tzipi Livni, who was the head of that party, in a discussion of the group, decided to shelve this proposal. But the proposal re-emerged in the coalitionary agreement of the outgoing government between the Likud and the Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish home. And in fact, they started to try and legislate this bill. They were doing some political negotiations. They had a diluted version, but Tzipi Livni, as Minister of Justice, was against that, and she then appointed me in August 2013 to recommend on how to anchor in a constitutional format the identity of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, so that the two elements of Israel's vision will be reflected in the legislation. I took a pretty long time, in part because I think the issues were deep, and I think that the purpose was to try and see if the initiative could be deflated. But what I did was I tried to look at my mission in a broad sense. I wanted to see not only how to provide a draft legislation that will be more balanced than the law that you have in front of you. But also I wanted to look at the question, is it a good idea at all to anchor this character of Israel or the character of the Jewish part of Israel in a constitutional text? And I submitted my recommendations in November, just before Livni and Lapid were fired and the campaign towards the elections started. Interestingly, this Jewish nation-state law was not a part of the campaign. But my recommendation was that there should be no constitutional entrenchment and no legal drafting at all, but instead, Israeli society should really look at its vision and at the question of how and in what way the Jewish distinctness of the character of the state should be expressed, and that this should be dealt with in ways other than legislation. So in terms of the subject of this conference, what I'm saying here is that thinking and talking about the identity or vision of Israel, as I prefer to say, is very, very important. But the idea of translating answers to this question into laws in general and constitutional pronouncements in particular is, in fact, quite a bad idea. And in order to understand why this is the case, I want to go back and look at the history of the State of Israel, how it was founded, and what the essence of the components of its vision, components which I think are an element of Jewish self-determination, B, democracy, and C, a commitment to human rights, how these three elements in the vision of Israel, I think, are important visions of the state when it was founded and to this very day, but how the interpretation, the implementation, and the debates about how these go together and how to deal with them is in fact something that should be, as far as possible, not legislated, definitely not defined in a rigid constitution as a super law. These should not be issues that are seen as legal. And since Israeli society, which is the purpose of the State of Israel, the welfare of Israeli society is the purpose of the State of Israel, Israeli society, with all its complexity on both the legitimacy of a Jewish state vis-à-vis the Arab claim and the intense, ongoing, dynamic debate among Jews about the meaning of the Jewishness of the state, is it religious? If religious, what sort of religious? If non-religious, what is the relationship between religion and national history? And all of this is something that tells us a lot about Judaism, about states with many religions and national groups, and about, I think, the framework of liberalism that is still the governing framework that we use in order to assess the effectiveness of states that deal with this part of such a situation. I want to also say that we are talking in all the conference about a movement from secularization, emancipation, post-secular, etc. So we are moving along history, and mostly, like Charles Taylor reminds us, we do it for the West. And I think that when we do it for Israel today, we should also do it for the Middle East. And I think the reality of the Middle East, which is a collapse of civic states into religious, ethnic identities in an unbelievably violent way, including violence against minorities within each of the territories, is something that should be taken as part of the context that we are discussing. Okay, so what do we say to this law? Why all of a sudden in 2011 is there a need in Israel, which is defined by almost everyone as a Jewish state? Why is there a need to entrench this part of its identity in no less than a basic law. Why? The question becomes even more intriguing when you look at the Declaration of Independence. The 1948 Declaration of Independence, which you also have, is the document that is used to explain and narrate the establishment of the state as a Jewish state. And if you can see the text, you can see that the largest part of this declaration is a part that deals with the justification for the creation of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And it's built on Zionism, the historical connection of the Jewish people with the land of Israel, in which it gave the nations the book of books, and the enduring connection of Jews to Israel through the dispersion, and Zionism, and the mandate, and the partition, and the World War II and the Holocaust, and the critical mass of settlement and culture in Israel, and all of this together with the partition resolution this right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate like all other nations. This is the universally accepted right of peoples to self-determination in their own sovereign state. Accordingly, then we declare the state of Israel is prepared to cooperate on the partition. We appeal to the United Nations. Then, okay, so this is the Jewish state. It's a very long and powerful narrative of why a Jewish state is justified and necessary. It is all a part of the general right to self-determination. And then there is the human rights section. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the gathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Now, there is cooperation with the United Nations, and the world, and the region, and the neighboring state, and we appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. Democracy. It isn't written in these terms in the declaration, but democracy. Okay, and then the last sentence is very interesting here and very important. Placing our trust in the text that you have, it says, in the Almighty, Almighty. Almighty is usually God. The literal translation of what they wrote here is placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, Sur Yisrael. The Rock of Israel is used at times as a name of God. But it was used here as a compromise in order to make the text hospitable and possible for the part of the Zionist movement and the Zionist leadership that was anti-clerical and atheist. So this is, and the fact that the translation is ambiguous is very much. What did the Jews do in the Declaration of Independence? They declare a Jewish state. It's a Jewish state like in the partition resolution. It's a Jewish state in the terms of self-determination. It's a place for Jews to be a majority, control their fate, to decide their culture, to develop their identity, and to guarantee the freedom to do this not as a tolerated or persecuted or killed minority, but as the sovereign majority in their homeland. Okay, so this is one. This is the Jewish state. It's not about theocracy. It's about freedom of religion. It doesn't even establish religion. No religion, no Judaism, not any other. So this is something that they do declare. It's a Jewish state. It's not a neutral democracy. It's not a binational state. It's not a civic state. It's a Jewish state materializing the right of Jews to self-determination. What the founding fathers and two mothers did not do is they bracketed the cultural debate, the ongoing debate within Jews starting from the very inception of Zionism about the relationship between Jewish people and religion. Not talking about that at all, and this is the result of an agreement that they have reached because they understood that if they started this debate about the nature of Judaism, who is a Jew, etc., they wouldn't be able to reach an agreement, and that will weaken them in their struggle against the challenge to the establishment of the state itself. Okay, so this is 1947 is two states for two peoples, Jewish state and Arab state. The declaration is self-determination for Jews, invitation for the Arabs of Israel into a democratic regime, a cultural Jewish inspiration for human rights not just, but human rights embedded in the vision of the prophets of Israel. Okay, so the decision in Israel is to go for a majority Jewish state in part of the land of Israel. The partition gives the Jews 55% to 45%. The result of the War of Independence, because the Arabs did not want to accept partition, was that the 67 lines is 78% of Palestine held by Israel, 22% of Palestine is not. What happened then? 1950, the Jews decide, following the proclamation, that they're not going to have a constitution. And in part, they decided not to have a constitution because they couldn't agree on judicial review, on the election system, proportional versus like regional, like you have in America and in England, which Ben-Gurion favored because he was afraid of having too many parties and not being able to govern the way we have now. And they couldn't agree on, as I said, judicial review. They also didn't want super laws. They didn't want entrenched laws. They thought they were challenged and they wanted the flexibility to deal with the issues as they came. The question of the rights of the Arab minority are not at the table at this stage. The question of religious and Jewish pluralism are very much there, and it's again bracketed. Jews are not defined in the law of return in 1950. There is a decision in 1953. Israel decides to continue the millet system for all religious communities and to create an even more intense millet system for the Jews. I don't want to go into the details. I want to go do it kind of very, very quickly. There were some developments, very interesting developments. I don't want to go into them. I'll run to the 90s. In the 90s, we have law and politics, interesting ways. 1993 is the Oslo. Oslo is the result of a debate among the Jews about the future of the occupied territories, and Oslo is the victory of the people who want partition, who do want to have two states because they want to maintain a Jewish majority or for other reasons, but they want two states. So this is Oslo on the one hand. On the other hand is the 1992 Basic Law of Human Rights, Basic Law, constitutional structure, constitutional status, creating a constitutional revolution that is pretty controversial, that gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review of Knesset legislation. Okay, so this is 1992 and 1993, and we have them together. The two, Oslo did create an ongoing debate in Israel, which still is there, as you saw in the recent elections, about the future of the occupied territories, especially the West Bank. But the constitutional revolution also created a feeling among some people that there is an erosion in the vision of the State of Israel. And the erosion that they say is the result of the fact that there were a number of attempts to complete the constitution for Israel, and to have a preamble in that constitution, and to have all kinds of features. And some people say that all of the constitutions, or many of the constitutions suggested for Israel, didn't come to be enacted, were liberal, neutral, liberal constitutions. And they were diluting the Jewish element and the uniqueness of the state. And there was another national constitution that also did not pass. And they said, this is a bad situation. The court is diluting the Jewishness of the state, and we need to redress the balance by enacting a basic law that will not deal with human rights, to equality and dignity, with very imperialistic and broad interpretation. We want to redress the balance and create a Jewish state. And this is, the result is this bill that you are seeing here. And maybe later we can say a bit more about the details of the law, but I want to move on and say how all of this was conceived. Now, if you compare the intensity of the commitment to the Jewishness of the state in the law and in the declaration, it's not completely clear that the law is much stronger. There are elements that are stronger. Many of the elements in the law are the reality in Israel, but they're not in a basic law. But nonetheless, despite the fact that it seems like a very innocent thing, as the proposer of the law say in the explanatory notes to the bill, in fact, what we had was an unbelievable debate about this law. And the debate was creating very, very strong camps in Israel. One camp said that this law is really an attempt to send Israel in the direction of non-democracy, anti-minority rights and Arabs, and maybe even something to do with the approach to the issue at the conflict with the Palestinians. So there was a very, very intense objection to this law, saying that this is a betrayal of the vision of the declaration. The proponents of the law say, no, 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 you don't understand. We are for democracy. We are for human rights. We are against some imperialistic and broad interpretations of human rights. And we think that, yes, we should take the Jewishness of the state seriously, but we are for democracy and human rights. We are vindicating the vision of the declaration. So I want to try and understand how to see what happened here and why the debate is so vehement, and with slogans and fascists and leftists with a big L and cosmopolitans and post-Zionists. I mean, this is really something very, very powerful. Now, I want to claim that when we look at the declaration and the reasons for the declaration, what we see is a set of presuppositions that inspired Zionism and the creation of the state. And the main ideas that Zionism had was that emancipation, enlightenment, liberalism in Europe failed. Jews were persecuted, and Jews were not secure in their identity because we're under pressure either to assimilate or to be excluded. So it was bad for Jews and it was bad for Judaism to remain a diasporic people. And what the Jews needed was to change something. Some people said, okay, so we'll be a diaspora people and we'll either assimilate or... But some other people said, no, we need to do something else. If we want to maintain a Jewish identity that is not exhausted by Orthodox religion, the only way we can do that for both Jews and Judaism is by re-establishing a territorially based community that will be fully Jewish. Not fully, not exclusively Jewish. Majority Jewish. In which Jews of all their attitudes to Jewish identity will be able to decide together how to develop Judaism and to transmit it to generations to come. This is Zionism. Now, Zionism, as all political and social and ideological movements, had many, many internal streams, and they fought bitterly. And they understood that if they could succeed in moving towards somewhat form of a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland or whatever, the national home or whatever, they needed to agree to suspend or bracket their Kulturkampf, their own debate, internal debate about who is a Jew. And this is why at the beginning they don't define who is a Jew. They refuse to enact these things. They want to keep the idea of Jewish identity, Jewish energy, Jewish self-determination, Jewish future as open-ended as they come, because the movement is energized by people for whom the Jewish identity in many senses is very powerful, and they share this commitment to make Jewish identity secure in a territorial base in the land of Israel, in Zion. So this is, I think, the great achievement of the declaration. The understanding that you need to do that. But you need to do that vis-a-vis powers and forces that challenge the right of Jews to self-determination. The Arab argument from day one of Zionism is, A, Jews are not a people, B, Jews don't belong here because they left long ago, C, the new Jews are not the descendants of the old Jews, all these stories are myths, and D, you can't have that because Zionism immanently is racism, because it's immanently is built on dispossessing us. This is our country, and they shouldn't come here. They shouldn't be allowed to create a Jewish state here. This is a serious argument, and it was decided politically. It wasn't decided ideologically, but it's still here. It's still here by Arabs. And what I want to claim is that the reappearance of the need to reaffirm the Jewishness of Israel in 2011 is not a repetition of what we saw in 1947. In 1948, Jewish unity was clear, it was tactical, it was superficial, it didn't touch on the many deep debates and disagreements among Jews about the nature of Judaism, because Jews understood that they needed to work together in order to establish their state. Israel now exists. It's actually a pretty powerful state. It's a pretty rich state. It has challenges, also military and existentials. These are not gone. But it's definitely not the situation of 1948. The new legislation of the Jewishness of Israel is not so much against the Arab challenge. The Arab challenge exists. I think what the proponents of this law are worried about is about the erosion of the support for the presuppositions of Zionism among Jews and among Western liberals. And the idea now is whether we can reaffirm a Jewish nation state against liberal, neutral states, civic states, one-state solution like Tony Judd's, and the like. And this is not only an argument with the Arabs. This is an argument with Jewish elites, both in the Jewish world Jewry and within Israel itself. The Supreme Court and the left, which is usually secular and liberal, is seen by the advocates of the law as elites who are really giving up on Zionism. And this is serious. They are saying is there is an erosion in the understanding that democracy, human rights, and Jewish self-determination are not in imminent tension with each other and possibly a contradiction, so that it's a zero-sum game, as like some people say. So you have to choose, you're either democratic or Jewish. We don't want to be particularists, so we're going to be Democrats. Now, Jewish here is neither only religious nor only national. It may be a combination, and we know that this combination exists in many, many collective identities, among other the Palestinians and many others. You know, Brubaker's and Smith show a lot of variety of tensions between these two. But the point is that it's all particularism. Now, the Arabs usually voice democracy and human rights. But when you ask the Arabs what they don't want a neutral state that is only individualist. What they want is a state that recognizes their collective identity, preferably to them an Arab state. But in Israel, with its majority, a binational state, or a state of all its nations, not a state of all its religions. So we have here, I think, the advocates of the law are willing, despite the fact that many of them, not all of them, many of them are religious, the advocates of the law are willing again to bracket Jewish law. Many of the sections in this law suggest otherwise. Maybe they look like Sharia is a source of law and things like that. We don't have that in Israel. I don't think this should be real. It probably will be out of the legislation. But they are willing to bracket out the religious aspect. They are not willing, because they are afraid, to bracket out Zionism, because they feel that there is a serious erosion in the acceptance that A, Jews are a people. They have a solidarity that is not only religious, and that as a people, they are entitled to self-determination, despite the history of the conflict, in at least part of their homeland, and that this includes some understanding that the culture of this state cannot be only secular. Now, it's true that the Jewishness of the state doesn't have to be that all Jews will think that Jewish law is binding on them, but it must mean that all members of the Jewish majority will feel that they want to transmit and maintain here not a state of all its citizens, not a state that has obligation to all its citizens to look to their security and welfare. A state that has a particular obligation to the wish of Jews, religious and secular, and everything in between. And there is a lot in between. The lines are extremely fuzzy, and some of the most serious arguments today are within orthodoxy. They're not between secular and religious. They're not even between Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. They're between Orthodox themselves. And the non-Orthodox streams are still very vocal, but very small. So what I suggest is that, I think following you in a way, what Israel should understand is that what it needs is to understand that its society is very divided, and it will remain so. There will be Jews and Arabs, all kinds of attitudes to religion among Jews, all kinds of attitudes to religion among Arabs. Not all non-Jews are Arabs, not all non-Jews are Muslims. It's really a very complicated, rich society. And the State of Israel should seek to create a political system that, A, is not only individualistic. It is not the kind of society that privatizes all non-civic identities. It's a kind of state that recognizes the importance to all individuals and groups within it, or most of them, of their group identities. So it does not privatize them. It introduces them into the public life. Israel should have a special commitment to the need of Jews to have one place in the world in which they control their fate. So there should be Jewish self-determination. In order to have Jewish self-determination, Jews must be a majority, and Jews must have an inclusive, bracketing attitude to what is Judaism and what are Jewish identities. Because these things go together. The state of Israel must be strong and effective enough to guarantee democracy and human rights to all its citizens. All its citizens and residents, not only citizens. This is a critical feature of the success of the state, of its vision. It is not negotiable. And this is the only hope that Israel will, in this region, succeed to remain a robust, rich, free, democratic country, which will allow all its residents, Jews and Arabs, and Jews of all persuasions and Arabs of all persuasions, to live in security, in relative welfare, in freedom, in a society that talks about the particular arrangements that permit this miracle to happen. And I think this is in particular important when we look at the region in which we live. And I think there are many people who are studying the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Israel and the relations among Jews in Israel. And I think one of the most interesting between Jews and Arabs is that there is a tendency in the last 4 or 5 years of Arab representatives, which I think actually the recent elections, what happened with the Arab minority is unbelievable. It's extremely powerful and potent. We don't really know how it's going to develop. It's, I think, a great opportunity. Because I think that it was fascinating to see that 65% of the Arabs of Israel preferred their elected representatives to deal with their welfare as Israeli citizens, not with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They don't want them to be saying, we're not going to sit in the government until Messiah comes. They wanted them to say, yes, we're Israelis and we are going to fight within your institutions, within the court system, but also within the legislature and the government to secure our equal right, equal access, etc. This is a major change. We'll see how it develops. And I think that the fact that the region around us shows that a civic solidarity alone is not always sufficiently powerful to support a nation in conflict. In order to support a nation that is struggling with powers that deny its very legitimacy, you need the willingness of the people to stand behind their identity and fight for it, and maybe even die for it. If you don't have that in this region, you're not going to survive. In order to have that, the main critical mass of Israeli society must be committed to Zionism and Jewish self-determination. They must. But in order to be an effective state, they must also be a democracy and taking the demos, the civic collective, the civic nation, extremely seriously. So there should be a solidarity between the Jews of Israel, between the Arabs of Israel, and between the Israelis as a civic group. And this is something that is extremely tricky, but is the challenge of Israel, and this is how Israel should be tested. Now, I believe that anchoring this in a constitution is not terrible if you anchor it rightly, but cannot do the trick. If you anchor it in a constitution when you are so divided that this looks like a divisive thing, this is worse than not doing anything. But what is critical for all Israelis to understand is that it cannot be only about one identity, religion, nation, type of religion, Shia, Tzuna. It must be a complex set of solidarities and identities. It's the human rights, very narrowly taken so as not to dictate everything. It should be democracy, the civic procedures of all the stakeholders in an effective, strong state, and the DNA, the cultural identity DNA of that state. It's better to live in a strong minority, a strong majority, one culture state, a nation state like Israel, than it is to be a minority or a relative minority in a failed state like Iraq, Syria, or Yemen. And it's not good to be a minority in a state that moves from an oppressive government oppressing pluralism into a victory of one cultural group. So being a Copt in Egypt was never easy, but being a Copt in Egypt now is much harder and much more dangerous. So I just think, yes, we should have a Jewish nation state. The nation state of Jews is connected historically to the Jewish people. The Jewish people, for a long time in its history, especially when it was non-territorially based, was defined by religion. Those who left religion did not remain Jews. We now have an opportunity, a creative opportunity, to create a Jewish collective that can be more pluralistic and dynamic, and in the same attempt to create a Jewish nation state, to also show the world again that the nation state is not an inferior democracy. It's not a weak, secondary, not real liberal democracy. It might be the most stable political arrangement for situations under which many other arrangements would fail dismally. Thank you very much.
Well, I failed Ruth in one regard, and I was supposed to be giving her time signals, but I was enjoying so much, I didn't want to do anything that would cause her to cut herself short. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I think I'll ask the first, and then I'll keep a queue. Ruth, as you were speaking, I found myself thinking of Robert Cover and his work, and in particular, the distinction between the jurisgenerative and jurispathic possibilities of the law. And when you talked about how this is an important conversation that society should be having, reflecting upon Jewish character and how that should be expressed, but that this ought not be entrenched in a legislative, let alone a constitutional provision, I began thinking that maybe one of the risks of doing it by turning it into a legal obligation is that it really raises the almost irresistible temptation to then give definitive jurispathic answers to the question of what it means to be Jewish. And I'm wondering if that type of concern was at all informing you as you did this research and reached the recommendations that you did. Yeah, go ahead and answer, and I'll start taking a cue.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very good question. The answer is clearly yes. Part of the problem with the law is very important. I'm not, there are lawyers who really hate the law. I am not of that. I think law is extremely important. And why is law important? Law is important because we are different people with different wishes and needs and assets and things like that. And if we don't want to start having a Hobbesian situation, we need law. And law is very important because it provides the monopoly over the use of justified force, and it permits us to conduct our disagreements in non-violent way. This is so important that law does more. When law entrenches a value, it supports a value. Value has symbolic tasks, and I think the expressive functions of law are very important. So I'm also for some legal declarations, and I think that some good rhetoric from courts about human rights is very important. But what are the dangers of legalizing, especially things that cannot or shouldn't be legalizing? When you legalize in a way that creates litigation, what you create is a situation where two people go to court to reach a decision. Now, courts sometimes, often, send you to compromise. But sometimes, A, they don't want to, or they can't. And they make a decision. So they are going to decide who is a Jew. Is the child of an agnostic Christian mother and a Jewish father, is she Jewish by her nationality, although he doesn't want to be a Jew by the religion? This is a question that for Jews, until Israel, never had to be decided by courts. And I think it shouldn't be decided by courts. This is not a legal question. I mean, yes, you have to decide about how to register someone, but this is a technical question. So our Supreme Court gave this marvelous, it's only technical, so it's not important, so yes, no problem. But of course it's not technical, because you are, affixing names. He's married, despite that this is a same-sex marriage of another country. This is only technical. What do you mean this is technical? This is important. Maybe I want this, maybe I don't want this, but don't make it technical. But with many issues, it's not even technical. When you go to court on a human rights issue, the court decides not only the case in front of the court. The court also says the people who I decide against are violating human rights. Now, on many arrangements, it shouldn't be the rhetoric of violation of human rights. It's an arrangement. We should think about the arrangement. It's negotiable. There's some things that are so atrocious that, yes, it's very important that courts say this is totally unacceptable. But on many of the other things, for instance, the Israeli monopoly over marriage and divorce, I think this is a terrible arrangement. I have done what I can in all kinds of capacities to change this without success. I'm not very optimistic about succeeding. But this is not a matter of human rights. It's a matter of the desirable arrangements for my society. The tendency to reduce all disagreements, political disagreements and cultural disagreements and identity disagreements to law, and to let them be decided authoritatively by judges whose claim to understanding the complexities of these identities is limited, is to me a strategic mistake in a society that needs to have a dynamic conversation about identities.
Well, Ruth, I think you'll be happy to hear that our center has facilitated the translation of Cover's works into Chinese.
Oh.
And that Chinese edition will be coming out this year. Mutaz, I've got you on the queue, and then after that, go back to George.
Actually, 2 years ago, I wrote a comment on the attempt of Netanyahu to establish or to get the Palestinians recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, and I said in that comment on Facebook that does not contradict the Palestinians' rights and or the Arabs' rights within Israel. And at that time, I was thinking of a Jewish state like French state for all its citizens. For example, I am Muslim and I am French. The other one is Jewish and French, Christian, French, non-believer, and French. So thinking of Judaism here or Jewish state as a national state, not as a religious state. What I have heard from you comforts me, although the law itself does not really says what you are saying, because specifically regarding the territorial limits of the Jewish state. There is nothing in the bill, and this is, I think, what concerns the Palestinians, and that was the reason why I have been attacked harshly by the audience who read my article over the Facebook, is that there is no territorial limit for the Jewish state. Those who drafted the law, apparently from the right-wing camp, they refused the two-state solution. So, which means that the whole historical Palestine will be a Jewish state with no place for non-Jews, although they might be the majority actually in that state. I mean, now the number of Jews and Arabs within the historical Palestine are almost equal. Okay, the Jewish are maybe 5% more, but in maybe 10, 15 years, the Palestinians will be more. So the law and your presentation does not really don't answer these questions.
Okay.
Another question is if we recognize the Jewish state within the 1967 armistice lines or 1951 armistice lines, what would be the rights of the Arabs? And what if the Arabs, after maybe 50 years, become the majority in Israel? What would happen to this majority if the law would retain the Jewish majority of Israel? There are so many concerns that surrounding this law if it remains at in this language.
Right. Okay. So thank you very much for this, because this, I think, illustrates what I was saying before, that the main challenge of the Jewishness of the state is not only the internal Jewish debate about is it religion, but also the kind of challenges we hear that are very serious. And I think what is noticeable about your question is that you are asking questions about both possibilities. Now, if there is a one-state solution, there is one political entity between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, then you say the numbers are such that making this a Jewish state is very, very problematic, unjust. And this indeed is a very, very serious debate within Israel. This is a very serious debate within Israel. I think there is a majority of Jews don't want a one-state solution because of these reasons. And you're right that assuming there is a law like this in Israel, and assuming there is a non-Jewish majority under Israeli control who votes, then obviously sooner or later the majority, if the state remains a democracy, and we want it to remain a democracy, sooner or later it will stop being a Jewish state. This is part of the reason the left says that Israel should not go for a one-state solution. But I think what is more interesting, as far as my concern goes, is why you object to Israel defining itself as a Jewish state, or reaffirming what is written in the declaration, which is, something that already exists. Why do you object, say there is a two-state solution? We go back to more or less the 67 borders, assuming a thought game. Now, what's wrong with having a Jewish nation state? You say, and I think many people say, that it cannot be a Jewish nation state and a democracy because it cannot respect the rights of the Arab minority. And I say, no, that is not true. The rights of the Arab minorities in Israel can be protected fully, even if Israel is defined and functions as the nation state of Jews, as long as it is a democracy with a commitment to the protection of the human rights of all Arabs, as it declared in the declaration. And in fact, many people are saying Israel is in a very bad situation, it's becoming more right-wing, democracy is eroding, and things like that. There is something to that, but in general, and in terms of the rights of the Arab minority within Israel, a picture from 1948 to this day is definitely much better. Israel is today more democratic and respects more rights, individual as well as collective, of the Arab minority than it did in 48. In fact, what I was saying at the end is that Israel proves in its existence it needs to struggle more and aspire more and improve the situation and it's an uphill struggle, but it's not a contradiction in terms. It's not as if Israel as the nation state of Jews cannot be a democracy and cannot protect the rights of everyone, including the Arab minority.
All right, thank you. Mutaz, could you hand the microphone back to Professor Fletcher?
Yes, it was a brilliant presentation, very stimulating for me. So I agree with you on the last point. I do think about the democracy and the protection of minority rights. That's, I think, correct. But what troubles me about all the thoughts that your presentation stimulated is reconciling the conflicting elements of Israeli culture. So you, on the one hand, you have the inheritance from the millet system, which you referred to in the area of marriage and divorce. You have the influence of religious institutions in certain areas. You have this is so complicated. I mean, the change some 20 years ago from what the residual rule of decision is from Jewish law to the common law, right? So the desire to keep mixing and changing the fundamental basis of discourse seems to be part of the culture. But that is coupled with something that strikes me as rather curious about Israel compared to the States. That is, the force of customary law is stronger here. You can see this in real estate. My neighbors and I have some kind of an implicit understanding. They have part of the territory surrounding the house. We have part of it. This is customary law, right? And there are many things that are simply not written down anyplace that are accepted by everyone on all sides. Now, what appears to me on the geopolitical framework is that we're moving in that direction as well, and this troubles me. We're not thinking about the solution of the problem in terms of principle, but there is a customary attitude toward now you refer to them as the 67 borders, as the foundational point, and that is beginning to, no one talks anymore about the 1947 borders or 1948 borders, but the 67 borders. And so that is now becoming the customary line of definition. Now, I'm not so sure I actually have a question for you, except maybe to see whether you want to take a stand on which of these many influences ought to be the guiding principle for future deliberation.
Well, I think that monism is a misguided ideal, and B, something that simply cannot work in this country, but I don't think that it works. It can work in any country that I know of any serious complexity, and most countries are very complex today. So I actually I like what you describe. I am very suspicious of looking for solutions. I'm very suspicious with looking at, this is why I'm against judicial decisions one way or the other. You win and you're the good guy, and you lose and you're the bad guy. I think these are not wise ideas of generating a very complicated life. And I also believe that what will create a good life together, a life of tolerance and pluralism, is a life of practices of tolerance. Practices that will allow the kinds of influences that are important. I'm working with many groups that are described in Israeli discourse as partly alienated groups. I think one of the terrible things that the 1992 legislation did, and that the conflictual black and white ethnic division rhetoric does, is that there are Jews and Arabs. They're secular and religious. They are ultra-religious and Zionist religious. I have found that the lines are unbelievably messy. And I think this is a strength of the life of this society. And I think that I can generalize, because I think that practices is what the solid thing of being together gives you. And when you have shared practices, it's easier to overcome ideological and principled objections. I asked my colleague here, and I believe that there is a lot of squaring circles in a lot of the political theory debates that we are conducting. And if we were looking for a solution, then there is no solution. But since we need to live, and my main goal for a state is to take care at the best it can of the welfare of the people and groups living within its territory. That's how I test a state. And the ability to take good care of individuals and groups is to take their concerns, their fears, their needs, their self-perceptions, their limits very seriously. And if you do that, and if your normative system is less self-righteous, less moralistic, and more facilitating, I think you are building practices that can support a life that can give people and groups what they need. And you need to give the state the power to not let these disagreements deteriorate to violence. I think that I always, I must say, was afraid of the deterioration to violence. The last few years in this region made my fear much more robust. And I think this is a first order of responsibility of a state to maintain the kind of ways of diffusing conflict and contradiction rather than strengthen them. We've just finished a campaign here. Campaigns usually work the other way, because campaign is, I'm better than him, vote for me. He is dangerous, I will give you what you need, vote for me. And this is a bad thing about democracy. You need to express the need why you are better and stronger and more promising than the other. But ultimately, when you end the campaign and there is a decision, then you start ruling and governing. And a government governs by its mandate, but it has responsibility to all its public. And if it fails this responsibility, this is a major political failure, not only of governing, but of the kind of rhetoric that may make this society an enduring society.